Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining our webinar today. Today's topic is cloud cost savings, myths, what is true and what is not. Our CTO, Gautam Thakcham, will be walking us through myths of cloud savings in the cloud and also identify tips with which you can save significant amounts. So I just recently saw a run through of his presentation, and he has some incredibly valuable nuggets of savings that you all really should be paying attention to. A few housekeeping items before we get started. This webinar is being recorded, and we will be emailing you the recording after the fact. Also, as you have questions, post them in the questions area, and we will attend to them as we're going through the webinar or at the very end. We have a special promotion for all the registrants of this webinar. We will be giving you enough points to model 10 virtual machines for free in our system. And to be able to take advantage of that promotion, what you need to do is create an account on our SaaS platform, which is http://sas.akashacloud.com. And once you create an account, we will add points in there to help you model 10 virtual machines for free. So we're really excited you could join us. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Gautam, our CTO.
Thank you, Garima. Thank you for the lead-in. So thank you, everybody, for coming to our webinar today. Today, I'm going to talk about tips to maximize cloud savings. There are various ways in which with good planning and execution, you can actually have a very cost-effective cloud infrastructure. So a couple of things. Everybody has seen, the benefits of SaaS in the cloud. I'm not going to address that today. And there are other ways of, once you're migrated, optimizing with serverless and PaaS is another way to save more money. But today, I'm really going to focus on what you could be doing prior to migration and purchase for savings in the cloud. And this is very important to do this prior, because what it does is that by doing some planning and calculating estimated cost up front, you have the ability to negotiate with different clouds. Second thing is, by planning up ahead, you can avoid the runaway cloud costs that everybody talks about these days. So with that, I'm going to dive in right into all of these areas. Bringing your own license to the cloud. This is a topic that we have been requested many times by our customers and partners, so I'm going to address this one first. All of the clouds, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, everybody allows you to bring cloud license to your existing license to the cloud. And they happen to be particularly in these three buckets: Windows products, Red Hat OS, and Oracle database. So I'm going to address each one of those. I'm going to address Red Hat and Oracle first, and then we'll go deep into the Windows. Red Hat, the easiest. All you have to do is Red Hat Cloud Access licenses and agreements that allows you to move your licenses from on-prem to clouds. They support a number of clouds, and given that Red Hat is kind of neutral to everybody, they make it easy for you. Oracle, on the other hand, since they have a competing cloud with everybody else, they would rather have you come to their cloud. They make it lots less expensive to move your licenses from on-prem to the cloud or convert it to Oracle cloud licenses as well. But if you were considering moving your Oracle existing license to an Amazon or Google or they're going to make it extremely difficult for you, right? So that's something that you may want to think multiple times before considering that. Now let's talk about Windows. I'm going to address that in the next couple of slides. Amazon, Google, and IBM does allow you to bring licenses, Windows licenses, and there are caveats and considerations that you have to be aware of. So it's called license mobility, and you have to have active software assurance agreement with Microsoft or an equivalent enterprise license subscription. The key thing here is that you have a Windows system and with whatever number of CPUs, whatever it is, you need to bring that particular system through image copy or some other means and bring it, convert into a VM on the cloud. And then that's how you bring your license over. But here's a couple of things. If you're moving from your on-prem to the cloud, you better know what's the size of that system. And one of the things we'll talk about is right sizing. What you have on-prem may not be exactly the size that you want in the cloud. So with this BYOL kind of thing, there arises a conflict in that situation. The second way is something that doesn't require any software assurance agreements or anything, which is basically you get a dedicated host and you get the appropriate licenses for that and you bring it over. A dedicated host is basically like a pseudo bare metal server in the cloud, which is meant specifically dedicated to you. Nobody else can put their VMs in that particular physical box. You can bring your licenses existing, or you can with or without your software assurance. Quite popular with development organizations, but here are a couple of things you have to be aware of. The moment you get a dedicated host, essentially you're getting a dedicated host and you're parking VMs inside that. So regardless of whether those VMs are running or not, you have to pay for that dedicated host as long as you have it active. And so this kind of goes against the very idea of elastic nature of the cloud when you turn on servers and turn off servers as and when you need it. So your savings with bringing your licenses must be balanced with the operational controls that you have to manage this as well. The other things you have to be aware of that you're responsible for managing those licenses. If you decommission a virtual machine, you want to bring a license to another, it's your responsibility. And given that AWS, Google, and IBM do compete with Microsoft, and if you're trying to bring Microsoft licenses to them, it's more than likely that the compliance and audits are going to be a lot more stricter for you if you move to those clouds as opposed to by moving to Azure. Now, Azure, on the other hand, they see this as a strategic advantage that they have about allowing you to move your licenses across. So they have a program called Azure Hybrid Benefit Program, which essentially they call it an extension of your licenses, which allows you to move licenses between on-prem and cloud and vice versa. They have 3-year, 1-year programs, and there are significant savings when it comes to Azure. So it's something absolutely should be considered if you're already thinking about moving to Azure. To illustrate what it means, how much are we talking about? So I'm showing you a screenshot of a couple of a particular customer case study in which we had 1,443 virtual machines to be moved. And this is with licenses included. If all the licenses, if you're already including the licenses as you buy the virtual machines, in Amazon, you'll be paying about $288K, and Azure will be $254K. But if you'd say, I will bring my own licenses, that $288K immediately drops to $223, and $255 drops to $211. So significant savings there. So it's not something to be not looked at, but as you look at it, you have to consider the other aspects of it. So the bottom line is this: yes, there's savings with bringing your Windows licenses, more so with Azure, but it's complicated. There's a lot more work, paperwork, and audits, and all that thing that you have to deal with. But keep in mind also that your current licenses has a term to it, and so after that term is over, isn't it better to just not worry about that stuff as well? So our advice to you is that regardless of whether you intend to bring your licenses or not, definitely understand the savings potential, because that savings number can be used for negotiation. So if you plan to migrate to Azure, definitely consider it. A significant value, 30 to 40% savings is possible for eligible systems. And if you're going to other clouds, if you know the numbers that you could be saving by bringing your license, use that to negotiate and ask for a credit, and then go buy the license included models, because it's so much more easier for you to manage and operate your infrastructure. So enough said about bringing your licenses. Now I'm going to talk about the next topic, which is very critical during an early planning stage as well. So I call this apples to oranges versus apples to apples. When I say apples to oranges, it means if you have a VMware infrastructure and if you're moving to a native Amazon AMI or native cloud system, that's converting your apple to an orange. On the other hand, if you have a VMware infrastructure and you're moving to yet another VMware, but in the cloud, it's apples to apples, right? So there are significant differences as you think about those. So let's go through some of these things because these are very important. CapEx to OpEx. By definition, one of the reasons why you're moving to the cloud is because you want to convert your CapEx to OpEx. So in both cases, yes, you get to do that. Now that you've decided, let's walk you through the process. Migration. When you're migrating from VMware to native Amazon or Azure or IBM or Google virtual machines, it's complex. It requires a conversion of your format, which means it requires significant downtime. So be aware of that. On the other hand, if you're moving from VMware to yet another VMware, it's much more simpler. You've done it many times. There are many tools available for it, and you can get away with minimal or zero downtime as well. Second element, remember I talked about right sizing. I'm going to come back to that again in the next couple of slides as well. Right sizing is absolutely critical if you're moving to cloud native virtual machine, because without right sizing, you're going to be paying more than double the cost. On the other hand, if you're moving to the VMware infrastructure in the cloud, you don't have to worry as much about the sizes of these VMs. You know why? Because ESX servers will automatically take care of making sure that each machine, regardless of how much has been allocated, will get the appropriate resources it needs as and when it's required, and will be shared fairly across the board. Bringing your license, we talked about it, it's complex and in the world of apples to oranges, but in the world of apples to apples, hey, I just happen to have an ESX server that happens to live elsewhere. So everything inside, by definition, I can move back and forth, and I don't have to worry about my license moving from one place to another, right? So it's much more easier. Next element, uptime management is absolutely critical in the world of cloud virtual machines, because this is the reason why people have runaway cloud costs. You start up a virtual machine, you forget about it, it keeps running, and you pay the bill, right? And you have to manage each virtual machine to make sure it's turned off and cold at the right time. On the other hand, if you're running a VMware infrastructure, you had a virtual machine, nobody's using it, it will get pushed out in the queue, and anybody who's more active will get the resource. And you don't have to manage each virtual machine. You manage at the commit ratio at the ESX server level. Operations, new paradigm, new tools versus familiar. Resizing is very complex. I'm going to talk more about it in the next couple of slides. On the other hand, in the VMware world, resizing is a familiar paradigm and familiar process. Skills and training. Again, same thing, new product, new tools, new training. And either way, there will be cost savings if you plan well and if you use the right architecture. But by going to VMware in the cloud, the savings could be significantly more. So that's something definitely should be considered. And I'm going to use a couple of data to illustrate this as we go here. All right, we talked about this. As you can see, VMware in the cloud is significantly lower. If you see this bar compared to the others, it's significantly lower here, right? Now, a few more information about VMware in the cloud. Azure does provide VMware in the cloud through a third party. There are two flavors available. Amazon also provides VMware sold by VMware as VMware in Amazon. Both are managed services, fully managed by the cloud operators. You don't get access to the underlying infrastructure. So if you're trying to run vCloud Direct or any of that sort, that may not be possible with those environments. And on the other hand, IBM, I'm calling out IBM especially here because IBM does have the widest range of systems available, from 4 cores and 8 GB RAM all the way to 192 cores with 8 terabytes um, of memory, uh, and the price range from 32 cents to all the way to $27 per hour. And you can get VMware licenses included, or you can bring your own VMware licenses or other VMs licensed by definition you can bring over as well. So, and consider this, even as we look at the whole your cloud transition plan, really your goal is converting your CapEx to OpEx and converting your applications over time into a microservices architecture to get the true benefit of the cloud. But converting to a microservices architecture is a process that takes time. So if you were to move your existing VM as is to the cloud today, essentially it's a temporary phase. So if it's a temporary phase, why not consider moving to VMware in the cloud? And get all the benefits that we talked about, the ease of management and all that great stuff, and migrate it, convert into microservices architecture over time as it plays. And I'm going to call out again IBM again, interestingly, because IBM gives you that VMware infrastructure at the same time. You can actually buy Amazon, Azure, and Google services through IBM. And if you're an IBM customer, that's a route you should explore definitely. Next topic, right sizing. Most VMs on-prem are over-provisioned, and it's perfectly okay to do that because VMware will take care of making sure that each VM gets the appropriate resources it needs, and everybody gets a fair chance of getting the hardware infrastructure underneath, and you can overcommit memory and overcommit CPU, and everything just works fine. That thought process and paradigm does not work in the cloud. Every machine that you have in the cloud should be right size. Otherwise, you're going to pay for a big house and you use one room in the house. That's kind of the equivalent of it. Many times, when you talk to one of the cloud operators, they might do a quick look at your environment and say, okay, you got all of these 1,000 systems. So we need 100 of this, this instance type, and another 200 of this, and 30 of that, 40 of that, 50 of that. And they do a quick calculation, and they say, okay, that's going to be your cost, and let's go move on. Very, very dangerous method of planning your cloud transition. And it's one of the principal causes of runaway cost. And here's the reason why. If you don't do a right sizing by each instance individually by looking at the CPU consumption, the type of CPU, the activity that's going on that system, you're essentially going to move to an instance which is not appropriate for that VM. And here's the problem. It's extremely difficult to change it once you're in the cloud. If you have 10 or 15 systems, reasonably okay, fine, you're going to be okay. But if you're thinking mass, if you're thinking thousands of systems, and each of them have not been sized appropriately, now you're talking about, a massive change across the board, which is extremely disruptive. And here's the other thing. Once you move to the cloud, there are several parties involved in making decisions. The engineering team, they have to agree to the fact that the size of that system has to be changed, number one. Number two, the operations team, which is different from engineering, needs to be agreeing to the fact that, okay, they're going to do all the changing, whatever needs to be done. And then comes purchasing department, who actually writes the check. Everybody has to be in consensus to do this. Many times, bringing this consensus in a large organization is a challenge. So what happens? People say, we'll deal with it later. And later goes on and on and on, and eventually it just kind of somebody in the executive level gets attention to the fact that the cost has gone out of control, and then there's firefighting and disruption and all kinds of challenges happens. So basically, instead of resizing everything in mass scale as randomly, the idea is to do planning up front. Yes, will everything be 100% perfect? No. But what you want to do is that 95% of those systems that you're moving to the cloud, will not require a change. However, the 5%, 6%, maybe 10% needs changing, and that's a lot more manageable for you. And that's the mindset you have to look at. So definitely don't fall into this thing about, you need 40 of that, 50 of that, 60 of that. That is a disaster right staring at you in the face. Right sizing requires analysis of your CPU utilization, the type and class of CPU. Whatever CPU that you have today, maybe 3 years old. The cloud tends to have a latest and greatest range of CPUs, so they may be a lot more powerful than what CPU you have. So you may not need 8 CPUs. You can maybe get away with 6 CPUs. So that kind of thought process is required, and analysis is required. Memory usage, storage usage, network, you name it. You have to look at all of those things. Then you need to find the best fit and the least expensive equivalent in the cloud, and that's the one which you need to buy. And if you go this process, 90% plus of your environment will not require a tweaking and changing and resizing as you go forward, and you will be much in a better position to manage your infrastructure and cost. To give you an idea, so let's take a scenario where we have an environment where everything has been right-sized, and for this environment, let's say $288K per month, right? And if you didn't right-size, look at this, $501K, right? So look at that. In AWS, if you move it as it is, 500K versus 288K, basically savings, you're leaving on the table of 42% on the table if you didn't do the right sizing, right? Any questions thus far? Anything? All right. Uptime management. This is yet another very important aspect as you plan your transition to the cloud. Being aware of knowledge of your uptime management is very critical. This is the very foundation for pay-for-use of the cloud, which just makes it interesting. If you're going to run a system for only 8 hours a day, you run it for 8 hours a day and pay for 8 hours a day, right? So which means understanding your current uptime is very critical. It allows you to plan your mix of on-demand, reserve instance, and spot instances, which is how you get the optimum mix of your systems for the optimum cost, okay? Uptime management can save anywhere from 15 to 30% here. In some cases, I've seen more. Not managing uptime is the principal cause of runaway cloud costs, okay? To give you an illustrate, I have an example here. In this particular screenshot here, we're using for this particular system environment, again, the 1443 virtual machine environment. If you look at everything running at 100% of the time is 288K. But we've done an analysis of that, and we see that on an average, uptime is only 93%. So if you were to move to 93%, now you're talking 261K. Now, this is a particular environment where 93% uptime is kind of the norm, which is really a very well-managed environment to begin with. Most cases that we see are 60, 70% in average uptime is what we see. So now you can see the difference, significant difference. And as you can see for this environment, 288% at 100% versus 261 at 93.1%. So you can see that there's significant savings here. Now, interestingly enough, if you're going to move from VMware to VMware, it doesn't matter unless you shrink the number of VMware servers, your uptime or not doesn't matter. So in a way, actually, it's good because you don't have to worry about it. VMware takes care of itself. Okay? You just need to make sure that you try to reduce the number of ESX servers. All right, so let's talk a little bit about spot, reserve, instance, and on-demand. Everybody knows about it, and what does it mean, and how you use it to save cost. Spot instances are preemptible instances. It can be preempted anytime by the cloud provider with little notice. Basically, they are selling you the spare capacity at that particular moment that's available. It's significantly lower. You can get it for like 10%, 15% the cost of on-demand. it should, because it can be preempted anytime, it should only be considered for stateless applications. That doesn't store data, that just calculations and some logic, and then the results are saved somewhere else. And you are responsible for instancing as needed, right? So, which is very important. We have customers wherein they use spot instance significantly, but they have alerts turned on that before 8 hours of their a few hours before their spot instance gets preempted, they get notified, so they basically scramble and get new spot instances or do something to make sure that their applications becomes continue to work. Reserve instance can be significant cost savings. And the break even is around 60% uptime, which means that basically if you have a system which is going to run about 60% of the time, all the time, then it's worth paying the extra upfront and get a reserve instance and book it for the entire term. Okay? So that'll be safe. Because once you have a reserve instance, regardless of whether you use it or not, you're paying for it. We do encourage not to commit more than 1 year. The reason is because cloud infrastructure do change very rapidly. So if you've got a particular instance type running on a particular type of CPU, blah, 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 and you have made a commitment to it, and if you made a commitment for 3 years, you may not be able to take advantage of a newer systems, which is more powerful, less cheaper, because you're locked in for 3 years. But on the other hand, if you have 1 year, it's much more easier to manage that. On-demand is most expensive, but it's the most cost-effective for non-stateless applications that are run less than 60% of the time. And it's important for you to manage uptime here. You are responsible for turning it off when you don't need it. So to illustrate an example of, reserve instance versus on-demand, as you can see, AWS on-demand versus reserve instance, you can see the difference of 30 to 40%, as you can see across each one of them. Bandwidth is another area which you do need to pay attention to. This is something that most people ignore. And suddenly, once you move to the cloud, the bandwidth cost, especially if you are a streaming kind of environment where lots of data goes out of your cloud infrastructure, suddenly your bandwidth cost could be very significant. It could be the most expensive piece of your cloud spend. There's not really much you can do about the bandwidth cost, other than basically reduce, if you can find ways to reduce the bandwidth consumption, and then that's about the only way. But there are some clouds where bandwidth is, a certain amount of bandwidth is included with the baseline. IBM is one of those, and you might be able to find savings in that way. Especially if you're getting IBM bare metal, there's a lot of bandwidth already included in that cloud. But point is, be aware of what you're going to need, model proactively, and negotiate. To summarize, so basically I've talked a lot about the various methods of saving cost. To summarize, bringing your license, model it, understand it, and use it as a negotiation tool. You might be better off asking for a credit for that rather than trying to bring your licenses and just get a credit and just use the standard license included. That might make life a lot easier for you. Apples to oranges versus apples to apples. Do not rule out VMware in the cloud. It could be a tremendous amount of savings for you. It could be much more easier for you to manage and operate as well. Bringing your VMOS license is automatic. And again, even if you don't use it, you model for it, understand the costs associated, and negotiate. Use it as a negotiation tool. Once you have decided and migrate to the cloud, to a particular target cloud, before you migrate, right sizing, uptime analysis, reserve instance versus spot, bandwidth usage, very critical to do that analysis upfront before you move a single virtual machine to the cloud, to make sure that you contain your costs, you get the best out of the cloud, and you don't deal with runaway cost. With that, I think I am done with my presentation today.
We do have some questions.
Mm-hmm.
One of the questions is, can you move SUSE Linux? You spoke about Red Hat, but can you also move SUSE Linux with BYOL?
Yes, you can.
Thank you. Another question is right sizing.
Mm-hmm.
So, how do you right size across, say, thousands of virtual machines? That can become a little complex. So, how do you do it?
Very good question. It's one of those things which cannot be done manually anymore when you're talking about thousands of systems. It has to be done through the computing. So essentially what you do is that in order to right size it, you have to understand how your systems are behaving and operating today. So first and foremost, you start getting the existing configuration. So you scan your environment, and you do during the discovery phase, you get to know for each and every single virtual machine what is the amount of CPU, how much is the memory, and what kind of CPUs are being used. So that's basically the compute unit. Once you understand these things, and then you next look at how are they being used over time. Are they being used at 100%, 80%, 50%, 20%, whatever it is. So you look at over time, right? And now, in the case of VMware, all of this information is actually available within your vCenter server. So when we, in Akasha, when we actually do this analysis of right sizing, we don't go talk and scan all over the place. We just go talk to the vCenter, get the data we need. And typically, like for 1,000 systems, we take about 10 minutes to gather all the data. Yesterday, I did one with one particular customer. They have 13,500 servers. It took us 76 minutes to get the entire data that we need, which allows us to actually right-size everything. So now, having got that information about the current configuration and the usage over 1 year period, now I can say, this particular server has got 4 CPUs, 16 GB of RAM, but at its peak and at the 95th percentile, we look at different models, it's only using about 45% of CPU and 60% of the memory. So we might say, okay, we will not give you 100%, nor will we give you 45%, we'll give you 60%. And we'll find a server which gives us 60% of that CPU capacity and 70% of that memory. And we'll find you the best fit and the least expensive model for that, and that's what we're going to give you. And that's kind of the exercise that you have to do for every single system. So the challenge for people is this. You might be able to understand what the current configuration of each service, but getting to see the CPU utilization over a period of time is itself a huge, difficult exercise. Unless you know what to look for, how you're looking at it, it's difficult to calculate that. And then now you have to go for each system, what is the equivalent? You have to do that manually. So it's basically, once you go beyond 10, 15 systems, it's impractical to do it by hand. You have to use technology. And we are one of the vendors for that.
Thank you. With that, we don't have any more questions, so we will conclude this webinar. Thank you, everybody, for joining in. And as you're exiting, make sure to create an account at SaaS.akashacloud.com if you would like to take advantage of our free 10 VM modeling promotion. Have a good day, everybody. Bye-bye.